I know what you're thinking. Gosh, Mr. Andrews, your beard is starting to look amazing. It looks better than Mr. O's already. And I just don't think that Duffield can compete with me on this. So take that, science. Anyway, today we're going to do our Articles of Confederation lesson. So if you just need this to review, or if you missed it in class, or if you weren't here today, this is what we talked about. The Articles of Confederation were the government that began during the Revolutionary War. It's important that you know that. And it ends up getting superseded by the U.S. Constitution a little while later. So it lasts for about 10 years, and it does some good, and it has some problems. And thankfully, those problems led us to want to do something better, which is how we have such an outstanding government today. So let's begin. Okay, first of all, it's a confederation. Now, this is different than the kinds of unions that we talk about in the union today. So a permanent union of self-governing states or nations for common action in relations with other states or nations. The self-governing states have rights which can't be changed by the central government. So this was essentially saying that if we looked at our country today with the 50 states and all that, if all 50 states agreed to do some things to help each other out over common problems, but nothing could tell them what to do. Now, that's not exactly what we have today, because the federal government can make people do things. For instance, during the Civil Rights era, when some southern states wanted to keep having Jim Crow laws, the federal government went in and said, no, you're going to let black students go to school here or ride the buses here or whatever it was. There's many other examples, but that's just one that comes to mind. So it's a government without any kind of strong core. Each individual state, each member has most of the power, and they choose to share it. Okay, we needed some kind of rules. Once we decided, hey, forget England, we've had our Declaration of Independence, we've got to have some way of deciding how we're going to proceed. It's going to be important for you to remember that during most of the time that the Articles of Confederation were really successful, we were in a war. So we had a common enemy, and whatever disagreements we had between Connecticut and South Carolina and anywhere in between, those states' problems were superseded by the fact that England was going to destroy us if we didn't beat them. And so that common threat really held it together and forced people to make some decisions and to get some things done. Because if there wasn't that pressure to where you had to get things done or something really bad would imminently happen, then you see where this will end up later on after the war, and basically nothing gets done. The Articles of Confederation are the first kind of official government of the United States. Okay, each of the states had had their own different governments from the time they were colonies. So the idea of having government isn't new, but the idea of having a combined government other than England is kind of new. The Articles set up a loose alliance. Okay, so we're all just kind of like, hey, we're going to get together on these things that are most important, but we are not going to allow anybody to be too strong or too powerful, because that's the very thing we're fighting with the English. We didn't like how they seemed to overuse their power, and so we want to make sure that there's nothing in this government we make that subjects ourselves to that same kind of abuse. And so they intentionally made the government weak, the central government, and left most of the power with the states. And if we foreshadow a little bit, when we get to the Civil War, the model for the government of the South is going to be the Articles of Confederation. They're going to really take hold of this Confederate style, hence the name of the Confederacy for the South during the Civil War. But let's back up, because that's still a whole bunch of years off. The government's run by a national Congress. Okay, every state, and there's 13 states at this time, gets one vote. Now, they're allowed to send any number of people between 1 and 7 to the Congress to argue, to make speeches, to consult with each other. But however many people you sent, whether it was one person to do it all or 7 different people, your state only got 1 vote. The national government had the power to wage war, to make peace treaties, and to issue money. So these are all really important things if you're going to be in a war with England. So necessity made for what those powers were going to be. You are already at war when you invented the government. So of course you're going to deal with the things that have to be done when you're at war. The states, on the other hand, retained a lot of powers. Okay, it was the states who could individually tax things. So if you wanted to raise money to pay Washington and his army, you had to ask the states for the money. You couldn't just demand it. Enforcing national laws. If a law was passed by the Articles of Confederation, it was up to the individual states to impose those laws. An example of how that might work today would be like if the federal government said, hey, we're going to make it a crime to spit on the sidewalk. And that was a federal law. But they said, we are going to make the cities enforce that law. And we're not going to send anybody to enforce it. You guys have to do all that yourself. So hire a bunch more cops because you're going to have to get all the sidewalk spitters. Well, maybe some cities would, and maybe some wouldn't because, hey, we don't have that kind of money. Similar kind of problems happened here under the Articles. There's no chief executive. So, in our government today, we have a president. In our state, we have a governor. In our cities, we have mayors. There is no single person at the top of the Articles of Confederation. You've got that group of congressmen, and they've got to work it out together. They have a, quote, president whose only job is, as president of the Congress, to lead the meeting, to set the agenda. But he's not actually in charge of anything else. He doesn't have any more power than any of the other members. So that's very different than what we have today. So without the ability to tax, the national government, which could coin money, they could make money, but they didn't have any income going in to support it. So the national money became worthless. States printed their own money, and that means there's going to be all kinds of different values state to state, which is a problem if you're trying to run a country. That's one of the reasons the European Union switched from the lira and the pound and all these other monies to the euro. They needed a unified coin so that the exchange rate wouldn't be weird all over Europe. Same problem a couple hundred years ago with the early American government. There was a lot of states that claimed the same land, and there was no way to solve that because unless everybody agreed that this was the answer, it didn't change. And since multiple states are fighting over the land, primarily that Ohio territory, the original charter that Virginia got when it was the very first colony seemed to indicate that this ginormous chunk of land was theirs that went on pretty much forever. They could sort of claim that, hey, we have rights all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And obviously that's going to conflict, but there was fights between the colonies over where the borders were, and they couldn't really fix that. And foreign governments that are still run by kings with really strong central governments are just looking at this ineffective conglomeration of the American states and going, man, they're not going to get anything done. All right, so that's kind of your big overview. Now, in the next 2 lessons, you're going to learn more about the Northwest Ordinance, which is one of the great things, one of the best things that happens from the Articles of Confederation. And then we're going to talk about Shays' Rebellion, which really highlighted some of the ways this government couldn't work and had to change, or else it was going to be destroyed from within. So let's just review highlights what worked with the Articles of Confederation. They were able to keep a government together enough to run the army and to win a war. That's huge. They were able to unite the 13 colonies in a common cause. And those are kind of the big ones until we get to the Northwest Ordinance. What were the problems? Because they were so scared of a strong central government, they made it so weak that it was hard to get anything done. They didn't really talk about it in the slides here. But in order to pass a law, you had to get 9 of the 13 colonies to sign off on it. So you had to have a supermajority, 2/3 to get anything done. And if you wanted to change any of the rules, you had to get all 13 colonies to sign off on it. So that just made it really difficult to get anything done. They set the bar high because they knew that would keep, states from getting run over and being forced to do things they didn't want to do. But in that drive to protect, the most minor of power, it made everyone virtually powerless. So there's your strengths and weaknesses, and I will talk to you when we go to the Northwest Ordinance. Thank you.